Good afternoon to everyone joining us for the October edition of our BITSO, brought to you by the Business School at the Northwest University. My name is Kasi Tole, and unfortunately for the next hour, you're going to have to put up with my voice as I pose some interesting questions to our panelists who are obviously going to be giving us some deep insights into what has become a very topical story in the South African economy this year in particular, and that is, of course, the fate of the business of ArcelorMittal. And for those of you that have not been keeping track of this story, it is one of those that has forced us to deliberate on the consequences of the policies that we have, the intersection between business decisions and policy decisions, and what happens when something goes wrong, and what are the possible mechanisms of correcting it all. So we are joined throughout this particular conversation by three panelists who've got, I would say, the deepest insight into the complexities of this industry. And I must say that before I started speaking to them, I knew very little about what happens within an industry of this nature and those particular mechanics. And I thought it would be important to actually just reflect on the fact that these guys know a lot about how this industry works. And our first panelist is a guru, but apparently he doesn't like that term because he is a person who, over the many years, has not only provided academic insights, but also practical insights into how the logistics and transportation and all these other industries work. And that is our emeritus professor of logistics at the Industrial Engineering Division at Stellenbosch University, Professor Jan Havenga. Good afternoon to you, Professor.
Thank you for the invite. I really appreciate it, and it's very kind of you. I have to say this is something that's very close to my heart and something that really worries me. I don't have to bore you with statistics about how our manufacturing industry has declined over the last 30 years. I just know that a country that can produce its own steel and have some significant downstream steel industry plants like we have in the motor industry in South Africa, for me, those are two shining examples of the successes that can be achieved. And a lot of the young people today don't necessarily, you all know, but don't necessarily know that many of these industries was actually born by government. They were all state-owned enterprises.
We are going to do a bit of reflection on that historical context. So thank you. So that's our first panelist, Professor Jan Havenga. We have our second panelist, who is the person who is responsible for continuously checking whether the intersection between communities and the economy and industries work. So what that simply means is that he's got a job that says that, wait, hold on, for the communities in which we live and the communities in which these businesses are located, surely we must be able to find some common alchemies to ensure that we all can understand the role that we play in each other's ecosystem. And that is the Chief Executive Officer of the Golden Triangle of Commerce, Jaco Verwey. Good afternoon to you, Jaco.
Good afternoon, and thanks for the invites. Looking forward to informative and productive hour. I think there's a lot to discuss. We on the ground feels it, and I think everybody can learn from each other and stand together and unite. And maybe by doing that, get some answers to the many questions floating around, not only in the public, but also, like I said, on the ground force here in the Vaal Triangle.
Thank you. My last panelist is a man who is famous for having a dual prism. What that means is that if you ask him about the historical context of what we're going to talk about, he knows absolutely every single thing about the history, but is also someone who has somehow managed to defy age and look forward and understand the prevailing demon of our time, and that is artificial intelligence and what it means for everything that we do and how we interact. And that is John Maganon, who is a technology and business strategist at Mining and AI. Good afternoon to you, John. And I think everybody's curious. Mining and AI, one seems to be a 300-year conversation, and the other is another conversation into the future. How on earth did you get the alchemy right?
Hi, Kaya. I think we had a very strange crossroads in life where you can do 300 years in a day. And I think that's the value of what you're talking about when you talk AI in mining and AI in the basic resource industry. We're really on the forefront of something really, really good that can happen, but it has to be informed by historical knowledge and skill. AI is a 2-month-old baby with an IQ of 4,000. Teach it the wrong stuff, it's going to do the wrong stuff. Teach it the right stuff, it's going to do the right stuff. When you lose fundamental skills like steel making in an industrial economy, then we have nobody to teach this thing what the future looks like.
Yeah, definitely a lot of reflections there. So thank you very much for that. And those are my three panelists. Now, Prof, I want to come back to you. I mean, we've just heard from John that, AI is the way of the future and everything that we need to do. But quite interestingly, all of these futuristic things that we do are still underpinned by access to resources and access to the type of minerals that enable it. So whether I'm operating my Apple iPhone, there's still that reflection on what the natural resources are. I want you to just take us back, just briefly, onto the history of the industrial sector and perhaps the steel sector in South Africa. Where are we? I mean, how is it important?
I think a lot of the industrialization was started by government many years ago, and a lot of success stories. I would, to some extent, describe Sasol and Iscor as serious success stories in South Africa. Also, in many other places, I work for the World Bank as well, and I get to many countries, and people have dreams. People say we've got resources and we've got dreams. So we will say in South Africa we've got 80% of the world's manganese. We have chrome. We have coal, all the coal that we need. We've got all the iron ore that we need. The only thing that we needed to import was hard coking coal. We also have semi-soft coking coal. But we have more than that. We actually have the proven ability to make steel. We already have the plants. Many of these countries in the developing world that I get to say they dream about this, but they haven't got it yet. We already have the steel plants. So for me at this stage, after all of that successes and after Iscor was, I think, privatized in 1989, to now go back and say we close this down, a steel industry is probably one of the shining examples of how successful a country can be. And in the steel industry with downstream industries, like we've been very successful in motor car manufacturing. I think we're batting above average there. To now, it's for me unthinkable to stop it. And I'm heavily involved in the rail rehabilitation work in South Africa, in the work that we're trying to do to get the railway going again. And I trust that we are going to get that right. And if you have to tell me today that we're going to import all of that steel, I want to run away. We have the ability to make it ourselves. We should make it ourselves. I understand some of the problems, but I'm sure we're going to discuss that.
Just talk us through what the value chain really encompasses, because obviously some people might say, okay, I've never heard of the steel industry and never experienced it, so it doesn't affect me. But it is an industry that actually is an enabler of many other industries. Can you just explain to us how critical a steel industry is to any country's economy, regardless of whether it's declining or up there? It's still something that plays a critical role in what we do every day.
Well, number one, we have the raw minerals, as I said. So many other countries like South Korea or like China or whatever have to import, well, South Korea have to import all of the raw minerals that they require to make steel. And they still do it and make their own steel because it's such a valuable commodity. We have more or less all of the raw minerals in South Africa, number one. And number two, we have created significant downstream industries like the manufacturing industry. And very soon we will do a lot of that, a lot of construction, a lot of rail rehabilitation, etc., etc. Steel is expensive, and if you can make steel yourself, it is just the multiplier effect in the economy is just huge and very important. So we have to make our own steel, and I think we got it up. I see my brother who knows more about steel than me is in this audience, and I think we got it up to about 6 million tons, if I remember correctly, very close to that. And it would be very sad, the numbers that I see today, all the steel plants that I see today is closed down already. I cycle past this one in Saldanha on a weekly basis, and it kills me to see that it's not working at the moment.
Yeah. Now, that's a tragedy. Jaco, I think when we looked at the intersection between industry and communities and the viability of society, it's important to reflect on the fact that you are from Vanderbijl Park, and Vanderbijl Park is not just an ordinary town or an ordinary city, but it is literally the very definition of how at some point in time, South Africa had a clear understanding of what its industrial agenda was, identified the nodes and the locations where industrial activity needed to be cultivated, and then made it happen. Talk us through Vanderbijl Park as just a reference point.
Yeah, just a bit of history, and I think Prof Havenga is way above me there. But I mean, Vanderbijl Park was for many years the industrial hub of South Africa, just south of Joburg. We had We had Mittal, which was ISCOR, started by government, like Prof said, and Hendrik van der Bijl thought this is a good place. You're close to the river, very, very centrally situated in South Africa. And then from there on, the role effect started. I mean, Mittal started, and out of Mittal were born many, many other great industries because it was close logistically. It made sense to be close to Mittal. Like I said, ISCOR those years, and Sasol was just across the river. So we don't see ourselves as Van der Bijl. We see ourselves as the Vaal. And in the Vaal itself, we also have Cape Gate, which is the biggest wire industry in Africa. And we have CWI, which is the second biggest wire industry. And out of that, BSI Steel got born years later. So I think the potential is still there. And if you look at a municipality like Meyerton, who's also part of the Vaal and doing very, very well, the applications and the development there with the Heineken factory which has started there, and more factories moving into the domestic area or geographical area. So yeah, the Vaal's been around, and all of a sudden it's hurting us, and the hurt is not directly, and I'm pretty sure, Kaya, we'll get to the effect Mittal has on the economy of the Vaal. But before that, the hurt starts when infrastructure fails. And we as the chamber has been present in many applications for big industries who want to move to the Vaal because it's the industrial hub, but because of a lack of infrastructure, they rather move somewhere else. And that's where the hurt already starts. And the fact that Mittal, Vereniging Long Steelworks want to close down, that is I don't want to call it the cherry on top, but that's the afterthought after many disappointments in the last 3 to 10 years of applications brought by big industries, and the infrastructure is just failing at the moment.
And Jaco, I mean, the downside effect of just that dimension is that obviously, if a business has worked out that in its business case, the best location is Van der Bijl Park or in the Vaal, and for a variety of impediments, they then have to go somewhere else, I imagine there's additional costs associated with not having your optimal or your ideal location. And those additional costs then feed into the question of whether you're still competitive and ultimately what the unit price is for those customers and consumers that have to do that. So there are indeed longer term consequences to the economy if we don't get this right.
Yeah, so you broke up a bit, but I got the line of question. I think the downpour from Mittal is various sizes. So, like I said, very many big industries were formed around Mittal, geographically making sense, logistically making sense. But remember, you also got the small engineering shop. The small engineering shop, which between 75 and 100% of his income per month is because of Mittal. And those shops are hurting. And all of a sudden, the ripple effect from that is that small engineering shop employs 3 people, 5 people, 7 people. So according to our knowledge and what we read is that every person working in a small engineering shop, a semi-skilled laborer, he supports between 14 and 17 people. So take 5 people times 14 people, you're looking at 90 people that won't have an income because that little shop is going to close down because Mittal is closing down. And so that's absolute core ground level. That's hurting. But the bigger industries and the bigger industries that looks after people that's struggling, the economy that's struggling, they will also get hurt. And in a few interviews now, I said the main thing that we can manage as a local municipality is to get infrastructures in place. The rest of the reasons, and I am not a blame thrower, I'm not blaming anybody else for what's happening. Economy is economy. But what we as a local municipality can organize is giving proper infrastructure at the right rates, at the right prices, and consistency, and that we can't give them. So all the things we'll talk about today that influence the decisions of Mittal closing down, add to that zero support from local government, zero infrastructure, zero basic supplies from local municipalities.
Yeah, I'm curious about the capacity of local government to even support business, but I want to come back to that later on. John, Jaco talks about something that is very important, and that is the multiplier effect of industries. So it's not just a matter of a factory employs 10 people. It's 10 people who then have got 3 dependents, and then those 3 dependents then go to a school and they support other businesses. So there's always been a big multiplier effect in the economy at large. But I think within the mining sector in particular, their multiplier effect has had a much deeper impact, because if you look at where Kumba and Sishen is based, it's in the places where traditionally people don't think that's where you go. So they go into communities where there's probably nothing to start off with, and Secunda probably being another good example of that. So I think the mining industry being centered in the economies has always had a much more impactful multiplier effect, because it literally creates economic activity out of the barren, the deserts of our economy. What is the role of the mining industry in just cultivating that entire multiplier system into the economy? John, are you still there?
Frozen. The image is frozen.
Okay, we'll come back to John after that. Prof, I mean, your reflections on just that multiplier effect of the mining industry, given where it tends to be located. So a mine is not going to show up in Sandton and dig up a hole. A mine is going to go into the middle of nowhere in the Karoo or in Nasda and say, hey, we found an opportunity here.
Well, let me first just put a different perspective on that. Your biggest multiplier effect is in manufacturing. That is it. So mining is upstream, and then your manufacturing industries is where you really perform. There is some countries that's been successful in not doing a lot of manufacturing and just pumping the raw minerals out of their country, like Australia, for instance. But mostly you'll do better if you combine the two. So it's mining plus manufacturing. It gives you the biggest multiplier effect. And I think that for me is a sad part of this, because a lot of countries, because of that, and I think about, I'll take again, my brother talked to me yesterday about the example of South Korea, where all of the minerals has to be imported. And then they still create a manufacturing industry that's usually successful. In our case, we can be successful with mining, and we are. And we have some of the world's best miners in this country. Our mining industry is doing well. It's well organized, well run, well sorted out. But sadly, in terms of the downstream industries, like for instance this, we cannot allow it to fail. That's where the huge multiplier effect is really visible when we start to make steel. And I think about all of the downstream industries that Jaco has referred to. I often tend to forget about them, all of those smaller ones, and there's many of them. And then also things like the motor manufacturing industry, etc. Important, and multiplier effect is huge. You're right. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, from a business chamber, clearly that multiplier effect is something that you track organically, because you'd say that we're having a conversation about mining, and then I come through as a mining consultant, someone comes through as a supplier, someone comes through as a welder. So you get to see the much bigger picture of just how big that ecosystem is. I mean, just talk us through how just important it is, that intersection between the mining and the manufacturing industry in keeping economic activities going.
Yeah, it's okay, good question, and I don't have the right answer. It's very difficult to track. It's very difficult to track. You know what? When we heard the first news of Mitzelvereniging, that was easy because they gave us a number. They're gonna retrench X amount of people. That's easy to track. Yeah, that's easy to do. But the ripple effect, and I think Prof. Hamergard just touched on it, especially on the car industry and the car assembly industry in South Africa, are 100% dependent on Mitzelvereniging staying open. As soon as we have to start importing long steel to assemble and build cars, we're not going to be market relevant anymore. So that is a massive multiplier. I heard some. I'm not going to use it because don't know if it's true, but that's thousands and thousands of jobs that could be lost. For us as a chamber, you feel it at the end of the month when we have a members meeting, and the normal guy who was smiling doesn't smile anymore. The guy who owns a little shop, a vegetable shop, the spa owner, that guy says, listen, the parcels is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. The guy still comes, but he only buys 2 tomatoes. He doesn't buy a bag of tomatoes. And that ripple effect is very hard to track. So do we only say it's because of a bad economy, or can we relate it to a small engineering shop who closed down because he doesn't have a little bit of metal? So it's also been a choking effect, guys. Remember, this is not pull the plaster. Yesterday, everything was perfect, and today, everybody's got trouble. For the last, I would say, 4 to 7 years, the VAL has been declining in productivity, firstly, and declining in support from local government. And I'm saying that yet again on basic services. My little shop, that I own, during the months of April and May, in 8 weeks, we didn't have electricity for 6 weeks. 6 out of 8 weeks, I didn't have electricity. So my manufacturing was zero. So I can run any generator I want to. I can't manufacture with that. And that effect has been a choking effect on the VAL for many, many years. And when the news of Mitzel came, the part of my brain that's, I hope, a business brain understood it, because you can't run a business at a loss. That's the basics. I mean, nobody can do it. And then the passion and emotion came with and said, but why doesn't government support? Why doesn't government change policies? Now we want to borrow their money. We're only kicking the can down the road. You can't out borrow yourself or outlend yourself. So the effects for us on the ground is felt 2-3 tiers further down the line. And the trackability of that is very, very hard. And all of a sudden, the bigger industries also dependent on Metsal is struggling as well. Like we said, the car industry. But the bottom of the line industry are definitely feeling the hurt. And that is combined with a tough economy that's already pushing us down for the last few years.
Yeah. No, thanks, Jaco. And at some point in time, I want you to reflect on the ANC's latest economic plan, which seems to think that tariffs for some might be the answer, but I don't know what the mechanics of that are. John, I see you back. Hopefully you can hear us. Just your reflections on the multiplier effect of the mining and manufacturing industry and why that's important for all of us to remember when we have these conversations.
My apologies. I was sitting in the car and the sun shines in the front window exactly on the phone, and it overheats and the phone dies. So seriously, apologize for that.
No
I think
stress,
we need to go back to the genesis of a number of industries. If we look back at what ISCOR in the old days was, it was a combination of the coal mining capability and the steel production capability and the iron ore mining capability, and a finger in the pie in terms of what happens in manganese and the influence in the communities, and those were interrelated. On top of that, when building all of this and scoping and scaling it, Eskom was included as an industry, the build-up of Eskom. So you can't unhook these things one by one. And that started, I was still working for ISCOR back in 1989 when the listing got kicked off. And that was like a cardinal sin back then, because you're unhooking blocks of a working mechanism. Then ISCOR goes and, or ArcelorMittal comes in, and you've got to think for yourself, what's the most important thing here, the order book or the production capability? At that point, the order book was more valuable than the production capability, because everything else is up at the top there. Then they lose their rights on decision ore body in terms of not applying in time for the rights, and goes into one heck of an argument, and you've got to get a new financial agreement. Then we have power deficiency kicking in on the same model, and they've got to pay a premium and compete with the power producer for coal in terms of basic energies. When you look at that interrelationship, it is far greater than the downstream of it. The downstream of it is, I think, absolutely tragic. We can sell raw material. The world wants raw material. So we can export everything but the power out of that previous model. When you go back down to what it means in downstream, and Jaco and Prof, I think you described it very, very well. Jaco lives it on a daily basis. I lived in Vanderbijl Park for 4 years, best 4 years of my life. And it was a training school. So the first thing you lose is the training school that trained engineers in this country, artisans in this country, taught production control. As an accountant, I went into control the instrumentation there and worked on the molds and the plants. That training school, in the same manner that Eskom's training school fell apart, we don't have that ability to build base skills anymore. But I think the way in which we had put together an industry to give us one of the most fundamental capabilities as a nation. You cannot support the civilization if you cannot produce steel, whether it's for defense, for attack, for food, for farming, for cars, for export, doesn't matter what you're doing. And I think all of the industry downstream, I look at, and Jaco, you're one of the companies that lives downstream from here. What do we import back when we have done this? So we export our raw materials, and if I look back in my days in ISCOR, you go and look, we would produce massive coils of steel. They would go downstream. Somebody would build profile products out of them. Those would go into the market. Somebody would, so you have a 3-4 tier capability. We're going to import final profile product. So you're cutting the whole value chain out. You're cutting a whole segment of industry out, because it's daft to bring in coils if you can bring in final product. And our suppliers from overseas are going to compete at that level. They're not going to compete and try and compete with the small guy that's doing specifics. They're going to compete down to the lowest level, and they're going to bring us final product into the country. it kills a fundamental skill for survival as a civilization. It goes further than just killing an industry.
Now, thanks, John. I think there's definitely a lot of very important insights from what you're saying. And I think the question of whether we've had the right balance between opening ourselves up to the global economy, our policy direction, and obviously just whatever instruments of enablement are necessary to support our industries. I don't know if we've got that right. But I want to go to you, Prof. I think one of the key points that emerges is that obviously at a point in time where South Africa had that sense of clarity about why these industries need to be created as part of this particular value chain, we're also influenced by the fact that most of the world was not in the habit of trading with us. So obviously that sense of autonomy and that sense of autarky kind of forced you into putting these things together. Did we then, at the point of the transition, open ourselves too much without understanding how some of the strategic industries perhaps needed to be insulated from the headwinds of open economies? Because it does feel like, well, you open up and you have to live with the consequences of things you can't control.
I think you're touching on a most critical point there. I mean, in my head, I've got a view of what is the problem, what is wrong at the moment. And I mean, and if I was in the shoes of a Metal Steel, I would say, well, the problems is input costs, is productivity, it is the cost of electricity, it's the cost of transport and logistics. And I would complain and moan about that. And another problem that I would put on the table is tariffs and the dumping of cheap steel from overseas, etc., etc. And all of those things are valid. So what that is in a basket of valid issues that we have not addressed over time, and some of them actually got worse over time. But there's also other issues that I think, personally, and I love talking about Transnet because I know Transnet so well. I don't know AMSA that well. I guess, and I get the feeling that a lot of the historic issues that existed in terms of management at AMSA, of being a protected sort of kind of industry, a lot of those issues were not solved over time. I think a lot of the cost issues, bloated workforce, not high enough productivity, not competing on the right price points, etc., etc. A lot of management issues also were not solved over time. And that you're correct in. Now that we opened sort of to global competition, we have that, we feel that, and we can see that, and we can. But at the same time, we cannot allow this to go down the tubes. But I think we'll probably still come to solutions and what we're going to do now. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Jaco, I mean, I want to put a proposition to you in that this probably starts off at a micro level in that, look, we've opened up. So somebody says, no, these bolts, we can get them from China. So therefore, let us import them. They're much cheaper. And then that takes out the South African manufacturer out of the value chain. And obviously, over time, as Forex changes and geopolitics changes, then suddenly those input costs become quite problematic, and yet there's no local substitution. It feels like we went through a process of we've opened up so much, we decimated our local baseline industries, and at the time when we sort of needed them to step up and sort of contain some of these fluctuations in input costs, they were just no longer there. Is that how it all materialized?
Yeah, I think Prof is hitting the nail on the head again. I mean, as soon as the can of worms open, then it will start crawling out. So yes, for sure, the substitution because of imports is a big thing, and that starts with small products, easy products. And he's right. I mean, as a businessman itself, what is your cost of operations? What is electricity cost? What is logistics cost? Which is a nightmare. He's talking about fixing Transnet. Please help us with that. Transnet was for many years Vereniging Mittal's biggest client. Now they're not even on the books anymore because they don't buy long steel anymore. So what's going to happen when Prof Havenga comes back and say we fixed Transnet and Mittal Vereniging is in there? We're going to import for basic services, basic needs that we can manufacture. And as soon as that snowball effect starts, it's just easier. I always use the textile industry. I mean, many years ago, I don't know much
Good
about
example,
it, but we had one of the biggest biggest in Africa probably, and now we got nothing left. There's massive factories closed there by you guys staying in Cape. And it was killed because I believe government didn't assist. And yet again, Prof is right. I mean, Iscor, because it was government started, was so protected. It was definitely overstaffed. It was more overstaffed than the ANC government at the moment. It was really overstaffed.
But it paid salaries under the ANC government.
I'm withdrawing that. Sorry, and the productivity was zero for the overstaffers. I mean, and then as time gone by and Mitchell came in, everybody's retrenchment. But I knew people who worked at Mitchell who bride 4 times a day in the yard. Didn't have work. They were on site. They bride meat every day. So I think as a businessman, sorry. Also, Mitchell himself, the ratios is in place,
Yeah.
and from a businessman's, business point of view, he did more right than wrong to be competitive. But as government, you must still be protective. Let's take our very good friend, Mr. Donald Trump, who says, I'm going to put 30% on this and 30. Why does he do it? Because he's Donald Trump. No, he does it because he wants to make America a bit better. So if our government doesn't stand up and say, imports, wait, go back to the textile industry. Why do I talk to some of our biggest retail areas in the Vaal? And their biggest fight is to give tenants the same space and less money, less rent, because they're struggling. They're struggling because of Shein. They're struggling because of Timo. They're struggling online. So in a small way, this is happening in the steel industry. If I can buy bolts and nuts at 20 or 30 or 40% less of the price, and they deliver it to my front door, I don't have the trouble of electricity that I don't have, or water I don't have. Laborers whose minimum wage goes up every year and I can't afford it. So my manufacturing costs I cut out. If I can do my industry for the same price, same quantity, for 30% less with all the hassles, and I don't have emotional connection because I employ 30 or 40 people, that's just easier. Close my shop, import, and that's what people do in all industries, and especially in the steel industry. And that can only be saved. We're not going to turn the ship by changing the cost of manufacturing, the cost of business in South Africa. Not only in Mitchell, not only in the Vaal. There's no way we can change the cost of doing business in our country. I promise you it's going to get more and more expensive as time goes by. But if government doesn't intervene and say, let's protect our major industries. I mean, I think John mentioned it and Prof. Alvenga mentioned it. Manufacturing steel should be one of your core basic rights as a country. There's such a lot of stuff, mining, steel. There's a few things that's the core of any economy. Doesn't matter if we end up in AI, sorry, John, and just do AI the rest of our life. Manufacturing, industrial, will always have a place, because even a 3D printer can't print a skyscraper. We must build it. We must start with steel. And we're farmers. I mean, 3D printing can't print what I need to farm with. So that core values, which should be a basic right, should be protected. And that's the first reason I think government should intervene, properly intervene. And the second reason is that it's a responsibility to create jobs. So we are so busy in South Africa by new entrepreneurs, new job creation. Sorry for the word, tell with that. Just save the jobs we have. We have the jobs, just save them. But everybody is putting up a committee and putting up a team and thinking ahead and calling themselves entrepreneurs. One person buying another business is an entrepreneur. He's a businessman. Entrepreneur starts something from scratch. And now they want to create entrepreneurs and create new job opportunities, but they're going to lose thousands and thousands and thousands of job opportunities because they don't want to change the policy. And I think that's the frustrating part from the chamber side, but also from the man on street side. You're so busy on TV hearing that there's a new committee who's now going to steer job creation. But we put thousands of jobs under the carpet and we don't worry about that. I don't know how that's helping us.
It's very tricky. John, Jaco raises a very important point, and this is the point of the policy question, because naturally it is government that can decide at some point in time that, look, we do want to be role players in the global economy. We do want to participate in as many of these multilateral platforms as possible, but we do have a responsibility towards our citizens first. And if some of these particular, multilateral structures end up with the consequence of a decimation of local industries, we do have a responsibility to find the right balance there. From your perspective as an expert in the mining industry, does South Africa have that right policy balance between saying that, wait, hold on, we can see what the global picture is, we can see what our place needs to be in the global landscape. However, we do need to ensure that we do not end up with the decimation of our industries, textiles being one example. And I mean, we've said many examples of that. Do we have the right balance?
Guy, I just want to make one quick comment. Jackie, you spoke about artificial intelligence. Right now, I think AI stands for artificial idiot because it hasn't learned yet. It is out there. It's going to learn a heap of stuff before it's going to be creating value for mankind.
Artificial internships.
Yeah. So to go back to what you were saying now, Kaya, I think the key thing is that we've moved these industries that we're talking about from being strategic industries that have 15 and 20-year views to existential industries, mining included. To sink a new shaft today, is there still gold underground? Yes, we still have a heap of gold. We forget that 42% of all gold that lies on the surface of the earth today comes out of South Africa. 42% of everything that's ever been mined comes out of here. We have the Northern Cape, we have all of the iron ores and the manganeses that we need in here. But the lack of development capital, strategic capital, has moved this into becoming existential industries that live on an annualized business plan versus a longer-term view on the Northern Cape. If you look at the Northern Cape and you look at what you can mine out there, and I grew up in Fostersburg out in the sticks out there on these mines that we're talking about, it's a vault of mineral that we have out there. But it's an overall systemic thing. We've got a system to solve in this country. We don't have mining to solve, and economy to solve, and power to solve, and those. I think if you look at the greatest cost component in electricity today is historical corruption, not capital, not the distribution network. It's the money that's been siphoned off. And I think those controls need to come back in to create investor confidence, to come back into the party and start looking at firstly, from a mining industry perspective, how do we liberate the minerals we have underground? And then secondly, how do we create a trusted path from there to final product that we can export? And we've got to look at this systemically.
Yeah.
No, thanks, John. Prof, I mean, the policy question is probably something that you've observed over many years to try and sort of see whether in the formulation of new policies, whether it is formulating trade alliances and cultivating trade relationships with countries like China in particular, and you can imagine why I mentioned China as an example. Have we got the right balance between ensuring that we are as a global role player, but also very clear about what the issues relating to our local industries are, and ensuring that we do not leave them hung out to dry, as seems to be the case in the textiles industry, for example, some might say even in the mining industry and even in the steel industry. What's your view on that?
I think that one thing is critically important. The solution is not as simple as just higher tariffs. Definitely not, because what you have then, as you are protecting inefficiencies. At the same time, we have to protect and save this industry. So, and this is often when we talk about strategy at the business school here, in the years that I did strategic consulting, we talk about discontinuities, things that if you add them together, that looks like it's like the two sides of a coin. You can't look at them at the same time. These two sides is very important. It's not as simple as just protect tariffs, because you protect inefficiency on the one hand. On the other hand, it has to be safe. So we understand that, and I think in the short term, it boils down to I'm a complete supporter of government taking over these steel mills. Somebody asked me yesterday on the radio, and I say, well, what is the floor price? I said, just nationalize them, you know. It came out of government, so, but I'm not 100% serious about that. So those two sides of the coin has to be put together and made understood. So I think it boils down to what government can do here is to buy these industries and even reopen some of the other steel mills, but then have a very specific program that goes with the private sector to rejuvenate the steel sector to work the way that it should work, to not repeat the mistakes of the past, to look at the various supply chains, to have on-time delivery, to produce quality steel, to look at the customer service around this. There's quite a few issues in the steel industry that was never resolved because it was a protected industry. So it's a three-pronged strategy from the government side. Number one, buy the mills. I think that's important. Number two, temporary some sort of tariff protection for a while, maybe is important, but coupled to a very specific program of how to make our steel industry more effective, more efficient, strategically more relevant for our country. But those three things do that, but definitely don't let it go. We cannot let it go. We have all the raw minerals and we have the steel plants. We can't let that happen.
Yeah. Before we drill into the long steel question at AMSA in particular, I do want to sort of check this with you. The idea that we have to be honest and acknowledge that some industries are more important and strategically more important than others is something that makes some people feel uncomfortable because everybody who does something believes that they're important. So there's one particular question that Thabo has put on the Q&A that says that since MSA is a strategic company as far as steel manufacturing is concerned, does it assist if the South African government can salvage the situation, for instance, by buying the company? But I do want to take a step back first in that, do we tend to shy away from being very explicit in saying that, look, this industry is far too important for us to let it go, so therefore resources must be poured into here, because people tend to be like, well, government must stay away, government should not be deciding who's important and who's not, the market should do so. But surely there must be some industries where we as a country say, in the absence of our ability to participate meaningfully in this value chain, we are in a bit of a trouble. Is manufacturing in the steel industry, is that some type of conversation?
It's the animal farm effect, Kaya. So all industries are equal, but some are more equal than others. And that is exactly why it needs to be saved. I hear and respect what Prof says, and I believe that could work. But did anything else that government took over the last 50 years, no, 30 years worked? So take over the steel industry, it's a buyout for Mittal, he walks away, he feels like a winner. And then who's going to run it? Who's going to run it business-wise better than Mittal tried to run it? And will government, when they are now the proud owners, save it like they saved SAL or tried to save Eskom? Or will they save it by bailing themselves out? Or will they then stand up like a nice big boy against China? Because I'm asking on behalf of the man standing next to his braai on a Friday evening and said, are government too afraid to stand up against China because we're still worried about the 500 billion we got granted in COVID? Why are we afraid to stand up? Why are we afraid to negotiate and say, and I also hear what Prof says, and I don't have the knowledge about it. It's a three-pronged attack. We can't just go and increase tariffs. Never. It's not going to work. But somewhere there should be a balance. There should be a balance. Like, I don't know if you remember the story, Fila se kind, where Fila Kumoti goes through in front of the judge and he said,
I think Daleen wrote the book.
Daleen Matthee, and she said, vandag moet jy kruip soos 'n slang, Fila. You must beg. So are we Fila Kumoti when we get to China? Must we kruip soos 'n slang? Because then we don't have the right for economic international partners, where we should be able to stand up and say, you are killing our economy. Do you realize that? How can we work together? If we want to be trade partners, I know you're the big brother, China, but now we must work together, not only on tariffs, but on this and on that. There should be different policies. There should be policies to protect big industries. Like I said, the animal farm industries, which is more equal than others, at the right tariffs. So to give you an idea, our local municipality, together with NASA, in the last 4 years, haven't increased one legal increase in the last 4 years. Every year there's a court case and we as a chamber go to court and say the tariff increase wasn't right. Every second day the municipality says we're going to cut off large industries because they're still on the 1987 agreement, which the government made with large industries. So large industries aren't even sure of electricity every day. So there's ways and means for national, provincial, and local government to say, we need to save these, let's call it 1,500 direct jobs, but maybe in the Vaal, 8,000, 9,000 indirect, 10,000 indirect, I don't know the figure. But let's save that by doing our job, doing what these people paid us by paying their taxes. So it's a three-pronged, definitely. Ask me personally, without somebody listening, I don't think government have the ability to run Mittal. It's a cutthroat industry. And if Lakshya Mittal, who's one of the largest players in the world, can't run it, I don't think our government can run it.
So, John, I mean, a few months ago when the conversation started, I wrote an article that says, well, you can't be saying you're solving an entity problem. You have to be able to understand what the underlying policy issue that got them there was. And of course, at that point in time, the political solution is like, yeah, save the jobs. And I said, but that's pointless, because if you simply pour money It will get them through 2 or 3 months, but if the underlying issues that have led to that business case no longer being viable in the market it operates because of the policy directions that we've taken, then you haven't dealt with the problem. How should government have approached the case study that says we as AMSA are in trouble in our long-still business? What should have been the response?
Okay, I think if you look at where we are on here, it is not a political issue because political issues become party politics and you're either right or wrong. So everything is what's happening wrong? Yes, it is. What's happening is wrong. We are losing fundamental capability. Can we solve it politically? No. Because politically, we are stuck in rhetoric. We're not stuck in reality. We don't live reality in politics. So you can't even put this on a political agenda and think you can solve it at policy level, because policy is a hypothesis that gets put on the table and that plays out between election periods. And we have municipals and we have nationals. So it comes back down to a far greater theme, I think. It becomes, now we are talking about what was a profitable industry becoming an existential capability. If we look at, and now, you know, if you really want to look at the politics around this, so what happens when Arsenal closes? Is Eskom going to change its strategic plan for the next 10 years because you no longer have this power consumption happening? So are we going to invest less in Eskom in generation? You understand what I mean there? Prof, you're involved in Transnet and in re-establishing capability. Right now, the most important line in Transnet is Sishen Saldanha and all the small guys exporting everything. And I run a part of the farm and trucking company. I've got 4 side tippers that daily drive from the Northern Cape up to Vanderbijl Park to go and drop ore. It doesn't make sense. So you can't, unless, and I go back to what I said earlier, we need systemic thinkers. We don't have systemic thinkers in our politics right now. We don't. A guy like Hendrik van der Bijl, whatever, I mean, that guy could have been, he was the Elon Musk of his generation, but he came and he did it in the country and puts all the systemic components together that give you the ability to run industry. And I think we need to look at the net effect of unhooking components out of industry, and we need to realize and recognize that there is no political solution to an economic problem in this country.
Thanks, John.
No policy solution.
We have a proposition on the table that says the IDC might just step in. Jaco is of the view that that is a conversation that says that the government must step in. And I want you to talk to us about whether indeed those are the same propositions. It could be a proposition that says that, look, the IDC as a provincial government will put the funding and let those that have the ability to manage the asset do so, versus us saying that this is a renationalization, because obviously the dimensions are different there. From your understanding of the current conversation, where are we heading, and is that the right direction?
No, I think you touch exactly on the point that I want to make. If I say the government must buy it, I do not mean the government must run it. There's a huge difference, and I think even in the work that we're doing and with the freight logistics roadmap that we've done now for logistics, we're making a careful distinction between ownership, for instance, of railway lines, ownership of ports and the terminals and the trains that run on it. That takes us back to the way in which, for instance, it works in the road truck industry in South Africa, where government owns national roads, but the truckers own their own trucks and they run it. Now, in this case here, what am I talking about here? I'm talking about the accelerated position around public-private partnerships that we see, for instance, in the work that's done in the economic policy unit within the presidency and the work that Operation Vulindlela do and so on. So for me, this is a case of, yes, I think government will probably have to buy it, number one, but it immediately should go hand in hand with the private sector actually run this. And we have to find the modalities in how we're going to do this and how we're going to do this. And in this buying of the government of this, of AMSA, has to go with a very, very specific, what I would then call a roadmap for change in the steel industry. It says, okay, we're going to buy it. And we're going to keep it open because that's number one, and we have to do that. We cannot let it stop. That's number one. But number two, as a policy from government, it immediately should go hand in hand with a roadmap of change for the steel industry. Where do we take the steel industry in the private sector being involved, private sector running it, and eventually even at the fullness of time selling it again? That we get to that point. So I think government must just buy it back. Allow the private sector to fix it, and use the presidency, use Operation Bulendela, use the instruments that we have available in terms of economic reform in South Africa. Because what we have here, we actually have, when we talk about Transnet, we're talking about economic reform. When we talk about Eskom, we're talking about economic reform. And those are the programs that is driven out of the presidency. What we have here is something that we've privatized without reforming it. We've privatized an animal that actually was not yet ready for the private sector. So just take it back, fix it, and allow the private sector to fix it, and then sell it to you. But we cannot stop it.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Jaco, I suppose the inevitable tension point is that anyone listening to this conversation would say, wait, hold on, it was in the hands of the private sector when things went wrong. So how are we then advocating for the government to put the funding and then let the private sector deal with it? How do you resolve a tension of that nature? Because people would legitimately ask the question, well, actually, the private sector didn't do a good job. That's why we're here having this conversation.
Yeah, I think Prof gave you that answer. Let the private sector run it, but let them run it with the right policies in place. Let them run it. Let's renew it. Let's identify the mistakes that the current private sector made. How can we help that and do that with our own people? And that will be perfect. And then you empower the people of South Africa, firstly. Secondly, you give them the support they need. You give them the infrastructure. You give them the roads to drive on. You give them the railway that makes logistics cheaper. You give them electricity at the right rates. You give them water at the right rates. You help them negotiating wage negotiations at the right rates. So you are the backbone of the transformation as a government. But get the right private people. There's very, very smart, very, very capable people in this country who's willing to help and whose hearts are there to help, who's major successful businessmen and women in South Africa. Get them, get the input, but be the backbone. You as government, be the change that needs. And then that change won't only be ArcelorMittal, it will be the steel industry. You must create the change as government. I agree with that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. John, there's one particular point that has been raised by Tsepo to say, yet again, South Africa is dealing with, the patchwork approach to fixing an underlying issue. We're simply saying that, let's fix this one part and ignore all the underlying issues. And he refers to it as we've spent decades of treating symptoms with reactive bailout instead of curing the disease, which is a catastrophic energy crisis that makes heavy industry unviable. Smart interventions require guaranteed long-term energy security tied to any support for modernization towards green steel. I think that those sentiments are not unique to Tsepo. There's a lot of people that feel that, look, we are having these conversations, but we're probably pitching them at the wrong level. We're looking at a particular case study, and the case study is literally the byproduct of everything else that should have been tackled, that should have been addressed long before. At what point in time do we have that frank conversation at the policy level and at the decision-making level to say, wait, hold on, this was not an AMSA problem. This was a universal South African economic architecture, policy architecture problem that simply created this one casualty. So let us deal with those before focusing on that. Should we go in that direction?
Yeah, I think what's happened to us now, we have kicked the can down the road so far that we've missed 3 or 4 business paradigm shifts that we've not adopted. So things have changed. The advancement of technology. I look at what happened to AMSA, and I was around in ISCOR when they listed. They took, and Jaco, you said it, they took a state-run company and moved it into a listed entity. I'd love to know who the key beneficiaries were. You know what the total change management was? Guys, look at the shares you get as employees, and you can cash it in. That was change management. No change on the ground. Nobody was told where this is going, and nobody was told what the impact of it ought to be in the longer term. So they took an immature, overstaffed company, 55,000 employees in the group, and they moved that into private hands. And what has been in private hands, take the order book and move on. What we tend to forget is we exist in an ecosystem, and we've got to keep up with the trends of the ecosystem, the maturity and the advances made by the ecosystem. So within the ecosystem we are in, we are highly fortunate to effectively in-country, in-border, own the greatest majority of the input materials into this industry. So we can effectively be a collective of price makers on that deal between steel and But we've got to step out and go and look at what an ecosystem needs. First thing an ecosystem needs is food. So we need capital in this game. We have what we have in terms of the IDC on the one side, but look at our public investment company and where pensions lie. If we want to build something that's going to grow pensions and stop wasting and burning money down, then put a formal plan together. But you have to create an ecosystem that can move this forward, and not just this, because power is part of the ecosystem, mining is part of the ecosystem, steel production, Jaco and the guys in the business chamber that are downstream producers who are employers and who do the development, skills development. Those things are part of this ecosystem. So for us to sit and do a knee-jerk reaction to what are we going to do about AMSA, we can do nothing about AMSA. We can do stuff about the ecosystem that should have supported it, the recreation of that, and how one gets to a point where you can actually live that world.
Suppose sometimes it takes a crisis and it takes an accident in some instances for the conversation to be elevated into the corridors that it needs to be. Does this conversation and the very clear consequential fallout in terms of employment and the disruption to the economic activity for a place like Newcastle, for example, does this then accelerate the awareness, the acknowledgement within politics and political circles, and then start ushering us towards the solutions? Because I'm thinking that until this happened, they probably thought that, look, industries have found a way to thrive and survive, so therefore all is good. But surely a case study of this nature says, hold on, you've got a broken system. Prof?
Are you asking? Yeah, no, absolutely. It is a systemic problem. It's a systemic problem. It starts all the way from the environment that is created by policy, the issues within the steelmaking industry itself, the upstream in terms of mining, and then downstream in terms of the downstream industries and the way in which they suffer as far as this is concerned. I'm going to repeat that. I think we need, in a very short term, the action of creating a roadmap for change for the steel industry of South Africa. I think we need to do that, and that should come hand in hand in whatever we do in terms of bailing this out, buying this from AMSA. If the IDC is going to buy it, I've not heard yet another alternative to this. Is there another alternative towards the IDC buying this? I'm quite curious about this.
Yeah. Jaco, I mean, that question for you also, does this type of crisis accelerate that process of saying, wait, hold on, let us talk and reflect about what we've put together as policies and our policy orientation, understand the evolving nature of the different industries that we need to acknowledge are important for our country, and then find a new roadmap? Because it feels like everybody just assumes that everything is perfect until a crisis hits.
So there's a saying in Afrikaans saying "Benoude katte maak benoude spronge." I don't know what's that in English, but when that brown stuff hit the fan, then usually people start to wake up. And I think Tsepo, who asked the question, is hitting the nail, man. He's asking the right questions. So yes, your answer to Tsepo and to yourself is this is going to definitely propel it forward, get momentum on it. And to answer Tsepo, hopefully in this process, which is now urgent, which is now red flags, it must be handled now. We learn to be proactive in other industries so that other industries doesn't also end up where we end up in the steel. When it happened to the textile industry, it was hush, hush, and nobody knows. And all of a sudden, there was empty warehouses standing everywhere. So hopefully this is awareness enough. Hopefully it's urgent enough that someone listens to somebody, say, let's sit together, let's get the right brains together and get the checkbook of the IDC together. And like Prof said, do a new roadmap, which is important. And also, like John said, let's look at this organically. It's a growing process. To fix something that isn't like this, it's a growing process. When Brand Pretorius from Bidvest always said, our problem is we want to make money. We want to build business and make money. That's not how you build a business. You build a business by building a machine. Get the right processes, get the right products, get the right markets. And if you do all of these little gears and you put all of this together and you build the machine, then the machine will make you money. But we're so short-sighted and say we must fix it, and now we're going to do this. Now we're going to give extra grants. Now we're going to. That's not how it's going to work. It's going to be an organic program who's going to grow. And hopefully, like Tsepo asked, it will grow over to be proactive in other industries before die benoude katte maak dan weer die benoude spronge. So let's hope that. So the last thing I wanted to say, sorry, and that is what Prof said, what is the alternative? The alternative is that this void that Mid-Sulphur is going to leave will be filled by small opportunists. And most of that small opportunists will import from China. So they already got a contact, they're already importing something, and they're going to broaden their spectrum, saying, oh, now all of a sudden bolts and nuts from which Mitsal made, I can add that to my basket. So it will be filled by way smaller opportunists and smaller businesses, which will benefit less people and slowly but surely degrade the quality that we use and degrade the economy even more. So this is by far the best option if hands can be taken from the IDC and private sector, not by small opportunists filling the void. That's what I think that's the only alternative, and it's not a great alternative.
Don, over to you. I mean, the same question, basically, does this crisis accelerate that process of saying, let us talk? But also, I do want to tease this proposition that because governments obviously take a keen interest in the questions of economic fallout and social fallouts, then their decision was to say somebody must find a solution. In other words, was this a business decision taken by the IDC that looked at the business fundamentals and said, we think this is worth rescuing? Or is this a political response? And of course, if it is a political response, I do foresee other problems out there, because a political response doesn't even need to understand what the forecasts and the probabilities are for the next year, which means that it becomes yet another case of state-owned entities of perpetual bailouts. What's your understanding of what has happened?
Frankly, Kaya, I think it's another kick to the can. I think what we're saying and what government has been saying around the IDC and doing, if you step back to the fundamentals, the most costly component of creating raw steel, and let's go to initial cost, let's go commercial quality CQ 123s, that's what you're going to cost, is the cost of getting iron ore, ferrum, from wherever in the world into China, the cost of getting manganese into the chrome, and they are by the buy costs, because it's small quantities in your overall metallurgical analysis. So it's got to make sense to somebody to come to where the iron ore pops out at 63% Fe, if you're mining in the right areas down in the Northern Cape, where the manganese, we've got 80% of the world's manganese. I mean, it's like owning the platinum industry in South Africa and importing catalytic converters. Why? And that's the fundamental we need to go back and reduce. There are people, there are countries, there are companies to whom it will make sense in the right environment here to come and do it, and to come and create it. When I talk about an ecosystem, the capital ecosystem, we can't do this alone, because we don't exist on an island as a country. We've got to sort out where we are in terms of who is in or out of our ecosystem. And we've got to go back to this point of being able to say, oh, you know, if you can save all of the logistics on getting the stuff to you to smelt it, to get it back to us, well, it might make sense to come and do it in SA. You know, where we had it otherwise. We're going to have excess power. We're going to have unconsumed power because of the fact the steel mills aren't smelting anymore. But this started very slowly. It started with Southworks closing down in Vanderbijl. And everybody thought, oh, no, cool. Northworks was the great hot strip mill, and you got to go run there. And it incrementally went down to the depth of where we are today. We don't have the opportunity to restart it in that same small incremental steps over the last 30 years. We don't have 30 years to restart this thing. This thing's going to fly. This kite has to fly in the next 5 years. We can't kick the can down the road. And what Jaco said, benoude katte maak benoude spronge. When you have a cat that's frightened, it has a frightened way of jumping. We can't do that. We can't afford knee-jerk here. We can't afford political rhetoric. We need an existential model to say, what's the minimum viable steel industry in South Africa? How do we save that? Then how do we build the next version of it? And how do we build an export capability? Forget about exporting. Just build the stuff we need in the country. Why are buildings falling down all over Africa? That's, well, I'm going to say that's imported steel. Let's not say Chinese steel. The time I worked in ISCOR, the rubbish that you buy at a steel merchant today, you would have bought from the salvage yard in 1990 at ISCOR. You would not have bought it in a steel merchant.
Yeah. Jaco, I'm going to drag into the politics. this week, the ANC
You don't want to do it.
comes up. They come up with an economic action plan, and one part of it is to say that, look, in order to preserve the viability of the chrome industry, they're going to come up with a tariff regime. It just sounds completely random. And obviously, tariffs have been topical for a different reason altogether. But what was interesting was the response of the Minerals Council that came back and said, well, they said that that's what they want to do. We don't know what informed that decision. We don't know who they spoke to. And what I want to put to you is that as an industry representative, how critical is that process of consultation in policy deliberations before a call is made? Because even with this one, it does come back and sounds like, well, IDC, AMSA said they were in a crisis. The IDC has a balance sheet, so therefore let's make things happen. Was there a process of consultation? And from your perspective as an industry representative, do we have the right consultative platforms that allow market participants to explain the entire spectrum of issues to policymakers before a call is made, so that nobody wakes up and says, I wonder who told them to do that?
Yeah, it's you don't want to really ask me political questions, and then you're not going to invite me to your show again. Gaia, I think it's a little boys' club at the moment. Somewhere along the line, they're sitting and drinking good whiskey and smoking big cigars, and that's public participation. They haven't asked the guy who works 4 night shifts a week and supports 10 people waiting for him to have bread in his mouth. So the problem can be that too little Indians or too many Indians, too little chiefs, or vice versa. I think the participation isn't done correctly. That's in my personal opinion on a small scale. I think before Mittal made the decision, he didn't need participation with us as the public. Mittal is a businessman, and Mittal is run as a business, and his shareholders want to know what's going on. I think from government side, the participation process is failing, and the only way to fix that is still to have the backbone to make the decision. So what is participation for? Participation is, I want to hear what you say. I want to learn out of what you're saying, what your feedback is. But me as government must still have a plan. You ask if you think it's political interference. I have an old saying that if you smell wet grass, you know it rained outside. And if you smell wet tar, you know it's election year. So I'm very worried that the wet tar we're smelling with IDC getting in, the government getting in, maybe wet tar for the election year, and that would be a mistake. So let's hope people realize that it's urgent. Let's hope the time is now. Carpe diem. I think that if we get the right people around the table, and like I said, there's very smart, very intelligent, very structural, strong people, and I think Prof mentioned it more than once. This is a restructuring of steel industry, not a restructuring of Mittal, not Mittal, of the steel industry in South Africa. That could be the savior, and that could be the only savior. But do we need big boys and big personalities to make the decision? Yes, we do. Get the public participation, hear what everybody says, but remember 90% of the people still Saturday around the braai. They think they can save the world on their own. So you don't need to entertain all of us. Just get the right people around the table and hear what they say, and listen to the profs in the world and the Johns in the world, people who studies this, people who knows it. We got the knowledge in the world. The rest of the world wants our knowledge, but it sometimes seems that a government doesn't attend to our knowledge, and I don't understand that. So big decisions in a very, very short timeline, definitely. Up to then, what happens? What happens, like John said, 3 to 5 years? I hope it's 2 to 3 years, John. But what happens in the next 3 to 5 years? Do government grants and grants and grants? Do someone ask Mittal, listen, Mr. Mittal, we don't want you to make money, but we just keep it open for 5 more years till we sort out our shit? It's not going to happen. Very, very urgent, big decisions need to be made. Steps up and take the consequences. That's the thing. Take the consequences politically and say, if I make the decision and 10 people is going to be angry with me, sorry, because I believe firmly, that's my belief, that I'd rather have 10 people who follows me, that believes in me, than 1,000 that follows me because they fear me. And at the moment, I think our government and politicians are scared to make decisions because now someone is going to be angry. Now, that's not how you lead a country. You lead from the front. You listen to your people, but you lead from the front. And we need that.
To take the difficult decisions. No.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jaco. Prof, last word from you. If the government is listening in here, what should they do in relation to a crisis of this nature?
I think we have a forum, and that's a nice one for me. I just want to repeat that. For me, it's quite important. We have the Business Leadership South Africa, joint operating office between them and the presidency. There is economic reform forum that's actually existing. It meets often. It is quite effective. It's had quite a few effective results over time. It's the forum through which the National Logistics Crisis Committee for Logistics is driven, also for electricity is driven. I think by AMSA, I think we have to do that, save it, and immediately kick it to this forum where a joint public-private partnership between government and business, BLSA and government and so on, can come up with a roadmap for change for the steel industry and handle it along that way. I think that's the steps for me works like that. That forum exists, use it, and let's save it, use it, and take it forward.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you very much to my three panelists, Professor Havenga from Stellenbosch University, Jaco Verwey, and John Meganen. And for those of you that joined us, thank you very much for your participation and some of your questions. I couldn't get through all of them due to time constraints, but thank you very much for all your contributions. Next month, it will obviously be moving the focus towards the medium-term budget policy statement. And of course, from what we saw earlier this year with the country learning how to do budgeting, we do not know how this one is going to work. So we will definitely schedule a bit for us to deliberate on what comes out of that medium-term budget policy statement and what it is that we as citizens should be alert to and what we should contribute to, because we now know that our voice is as important as the voice of the politicians in public decision-making. Thank you very much and have a wonderful afternoon. My name is Kasi Tole, and thank you very much to the Northwest University Business School for allowing us to convene on a Friday afternoon. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, Gaia. Thanks, Prof. Thanks,
Thank you.
Jaco.
Thank you.
Goodbye, guys.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.